What is happening, team? It's your host, Coach Hawk with Legion Athletics and HawkFit Coaching, and I'm joined today by Lauren Colenso, who has quite the resume when it comes to her academic background. She's currently finishing up her PhD at McMaster's University, and she's worked with some individuals that I've had on the podcast as far as Dr. Bill Campbell goes. She's also worked with Dr. Andy Galpin, and she's currently working with Dr. Stu Phillips. She's a coach at Stronger by Science, and I'm not sure, do you do some work with Mass Research Review as well?
Yes, I recently joined Mass.
Awesome, incredible. So for the basis of today's episode, we will be touching on the importance of the menstrual cycle and how you can take some things away with regards to structuring your training during that period of time. I know that people tend to give blanket recommendations as far as your follicular phase and luteal phase goes within the menstrual cycle. And being someone who coaches quite a bit of women, it is an important consideration for me to take into account some of their subjective feedback for how they're feeling during that time of the month and whether we should push with regards to training or pull back with regards to training. So, Lauren, I'd love to hear from you. And why don't you go ahead and give the audience a little bit of intro about yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on. As you said, I'm finishing up my PhD in Stu Phillips' lab at McMaster University. And before that, I was in Florida, in Tampa, getting my master's with Dr. Bill Campbell. I did some work there looking at high versus lower training volume in women. And for a summer in my master's, I worked for Andy Galpin, which was a really great experience, kind of diving into a bit more of the molecular side of things, which I'm also really fortunate to be able to do here. We do muscle biopsies, we do really extensive wet lab work. And as you said, I'm also a coach. I was actually a coach first before I kind of dove into the science and the research. So I really strive to strike a balance between kind of going down the rabbit hole with my researcher hat, but also being able to pull back and say, what does this mean? Is this really translational? Because I think that we need to definitely push the boundaries of science, but we also need to make sure that we're informing the coaches and the athletes and really making our findings as applicable as possible for them.
That's awesome. And I love the fact that, some people can dive a bit too deep in the rabbit hole and they get a bit too focused on the mechanisms of things without necessarily tying it all together with a practical application. So as far as research in the field of menstrual phase based training, it is still a relatively new area of research with regards to we don't have as much literature on that compared to the impact of testosterone, for example, and how it impacts males. And it's relatively hard to get a sample size of just women who resistance train, and then we measure the impacts of what occurs within a study. And you recently just had a paper published, so I'd love to hear about the process of that and the findings of that study.
Sure. So I was really interested in this area because one of the most common reasons why women are excluded from exercise science studies is because there is an assumption that the hormonal changes throughout the menstrual cycle will have an impact on performance or training induced adaptations. And so it's easier to study young men because those hormones are, you know, they fluctuate daily, but in a given month, we're not seeing major fluctuations in hormones as you are with a woman with a menstrual cycle. So part of the reason I wanted to explore this research question for my PhD is I think what we don't know yet is, does it matter? And if it does, then we can develop some best practices around designing a study to make sure that we're keeping those important factors in mind, to make sure that to make sure that we aren't kind of missing something, or that we're acknowledging the fact that, okay, you're in your follicular phase or your luteal phase, and this hormonal profile might influence this testing in the lab. However, if it's not important, then we can start to work towards a place where we can include men and women in the same sample. And we don't need to be concerned about whether you're in your early follicular phase, or whether you're on a hormonal contraceptive, or whether you're a man, right? So I think big picture, that is what really drives my interest in this area. But as you said, I recently published a paper. It's open access, so you can read it for free. And really, the main goal there was to look at the body of literature as a whole on the influence of the menstrual cycle phase on acute exercise performance, and also visit this concept of phase-based training, whereby long term, if you are adjusting your training according to menstrual cycle phase, would that potentially have an effect on the training-induced adaptation? And so for my research area, we'd be mostly talking about muscle hypertrophy and strength. So I think one of the most important things to highlight in the literature here is the quality of the evidence. And our paper really makes a point of evaluating that. Others have as well. There's a great meta-analysis that you mentioned before the call, out of Kirsty Elliott-Sales' lab, looking at the same question. And one of the major problems with the research in this area is the methodological quality, such that they assume that all of the participants have the same cycle length. They assume that the ovulation timing for every participant is the same, based on the fact that, an average cycle is 28 days, and the average ovulation day is day 14. But there is so much variability between women, and also in some cases within a woman from cycle to cycle. So it's really important that if we're going to tease out the nuances of what looks like isn't going to be a large effect anyway, we need to be very sure that we are testing in the phase that we intend to. And part of that is a pretty rigorous approach to having participants track and map their cycles prior to doing any testing in the lab. And also making sure that we are testing, if we're testing in multiple phases, that we continue to track and map and use some sort of ovulation verification method. The most effective test for that is either a urinary reactive strip that you can buy at the drugstore, or a blood test. And that would measure the spike in luteinizing hormone that is indicative of ovulation. So I'll pause there in case you have any questions so far.
Nope, great recap so far.
Okay. So I'll start by just reviewing the hormone fluctuations that we would see in a normal menstrual cycle. At the onset of menstruation, so day one, the ovarian hormones are low. So we're talking about estradiol and progesterone. And throughout the first phase, or the follicular phase of the cycle, progesterone stays low, but we see an increase in estradiol. And that peaks before ovulation, so kind of mid-cycle. Then we have that spike in luteinizing hormone, which can last maybe up to 24, 48 hours. and then we're in the post-ovulatory or the luteal phase, where we start to see an increase in progesterone, and that remains kind of moderately high. We also see moderate to high levels of estradiol. So they're not as high as they were in the peak prior to ovulation, but both hormones are still kind of moderately high, and then they decrease at the end of the cycle and we start all over again. So the idea that either acute performance or longer term training adaptations would be influenced by the cycle phase has to do with the concept that either estradiol or progesterone are somehow anabolic or catabolic, or that if estradiol is anabolic, then perhaps progesterone is counteracting the anabolic effects. And so the argument there is that perhaps the training in the follicular phase would be superior to training in the luteal phase. The other advice I've seen on the internet is that you would need more protein in your luteal phase to counteract the catabolic effects of progesterone. Now, remember when I said the beginning of the follicular phase, both hormones are low. So when we actually look at the number of days where we have the high estrogen in the follicular phase, it's not that many. It's maybe half the phase, right? So the idea that kind of increasing your training volume during that time would be so powerful and so anabolic that it would be superior to just kind of training normally throughout the whole cycle is something that it is not supported by the literature at this time. We do see that the absence of estrogen is problematic for muscle growth in animal models. But when we're talking about short-term fluctuations in humans, there isn't really an evidence to support the idea that we should be kind of altering our training, or that there's something substantially anabolic about estradiol. And to that point, we know very, very little about progesterone in skeletal muscle, other than there are progesterone receptors. So the assumption that progesterone is catabolic is really simply based on the assumption that estrogen is anabolic. So there's so much more work to be done to really understand the mechanism of action of progesterone before we can say with any certainty, estrogen is good and progesterone is bad when it comes to muscle.
That was a great recap. And I think oftentimes a lot of people are caught in the trap of speaking in absolutes. So I do think that this is definitely an area of research that we need more literature on. And based on your recap of estrogen being anabolic, or so to said, and progesterone being catabolic, what is some of those, or what are some of those assumptions based off of? Is it based off of previous literature, or is it just based off subjective feelings of how those hormones make the individual feel?
Yeah, so the mechanisms of estrogen are better understood because of animal model work, where there will do an ovarectomy, so in a rodent, and essentially induce incredibly low levels of both hormones. And in those models, you see that the absence of ovarian hormones is detrimental. So the muscle growth will be impeded, strength will be impeded. And if you then supplement with the hormones, then you can see some of the return of the stimulatory growth processes in muscle. So that is, it's definitely compelling mechanistic work, but the extent to which that translates to humans is certainly to be determined, because the absence of something being problematic is not the same as the presence of something being beneficial. And so if we think about the range of the hormone levels throughout a normal cycle, if those are going to be much higher, than, even though they fluctuate, than they would be if we completely removed the hormones. And so in that sense, that model is closer to somebody who's way post menopause, but still the hormone levels of a postmenopausal women are not going to be quite as low. So we're looking at a very extreme model to say, all right, maybe the absence of estradiol is not a good thing. And there isn't a circumstance in a normally menstruating woman where you would ever get to levels that are that low.
That's a great point. That's a great point. So as far as some of the takeaways thus far goes, everyone's cycle with regards to time length is different. Everyone's fluctuation of estrogen is going to be different. Everyone's fluctuation of progesterone is going to be different. And for practical application, for some of my clients, I tell them the best thing you could do is honestly just track your cycle, because data is power. And based off of that, you'll be in a position to where you could better understand if you do need to pull back on your training. So for example, some of my clients, when they do start their period, they experience things such as bloating, lethargy, reductions in training performance. So during that period of time, I tell them to take an auto-regulated based approach. If you feel like it's needed and you need to pull back on your training, then definitely do so, and you could implement a reactive deload, so to say. And so for some of your takeaways from what you've seen in the literature and the new paper that you've came out with, what are some takeaways you could give the audience?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with your approach that you're taking with your clients. I think that the idea that training throughout a whole menstrual cycle phase of the cycle should be altered on a regular basis is not the same question as, do we respond to, or do we tweak our training? Do we make a reduction in volume or intensity? Do we switch up an exercise that day because we're experiencing menstrual symptoms? And as you said, the symptoms are most common in maybe the first 5 days of the cycle. Some people will also experience them, towards the last few days of the cycle. So we're talking like late luteal, early follicular phase. But for the most part, women don't experience these symptoms for longer than a couple days. And so we're talking about changing a couple sessions, not drastically altering your programming for 2 weeks. So I think it's really important to make that distinction. Menstrual symptoms and working around those are something that is highly individualized, because some women have much more severe symptoms than others. For some women, exercise makes them feel better. For some, they can't. Exercise feels kind of impossible that day, and that's fine, right? So, but we should be kind of reactive based on the symptoms that are present when we are planning our session for that day, as opposed to saying, oh, for these 2 weeks, no exercise for you, just yoga and light stretching because you're in your luteal phase, or where that would be much too aggressive and unnecessary, in terms of kind of overhauling your training just because you have a menstrual cycle.
You're going to atrophy away. Stop training.
Right.
Okay, so we've touched on the importance and fluctuations within training during the menstrual cycle. Something that was probably difficult for you to manage while conducting the paper was getting people who are actually not on birth control. And so some of the literature that I've seen, it seems to have an impact on training adaptations, although not too significant. I'd love to dive into some of that with you.
Sure. Yeah. The same group that I mentioned earlier that did the meta-analysis on the menstrual cycle phase did a similar meta-analysis on oral contraceptives. And though it's similar in the sense that most of the literature in that area is kind of moderate quality, but it's also that the results are kind of all over the place. And there appears to be a lot of variability there. So just as there is in the menstrual cycle phase research, and it just to make it even more complicated, maybe there's some differences, for some individuals from one pill to another, and so and the symptoms come into play as well, because there are some people who don't respond well to a particular formulation of the synthetic hormones. Um, and, and those wouldn't be kind of phase-based differences or symptoms. Those would be symptoms you experience pretty consistently across the 3 weeks that you're taking the active hormone pill. But I think that where the takeaway is sort of the same, where there's definitely no evidence to suggest that hormonal contraceptives are really beneficial or really detrimental to performance or to training induced adaptations. But perhaps at the individual level, you might see a difference or feel a difference going from no contraceptive to one contraceptive and then maybe switching to another. And so I would, from a kind of practical perspective, I'd say we take an individualized approach to that as well, while of course remembering that the purpose for the majority of women who are on a hormonal contraceptive is to prevent pregnancy and not to maximize exercise performance.
Mm. So do you think it would be safe to say that women should, look into the androgenicity of their birth control? And I'm not sure, I've never been on birth control, but go through like a trial phase and see how it impacts them?
So I think that when we're talking about the endogenous hormone fluctuations in people who are naturally cycling or have a regular menstrual cycle, then we really do see from week to week different hormonal profiles. When we look at the hormonal profile of somebody who's on a hormonal contraceptive, um, the dose of the synthetic hormone or the exogenous hormone that you're taking is very low, particularly these days. If you were taking birth control pills in the 1970s, the doses were much higher, but over time, these have been formulated and reformulated. And we talk about the generation of the progestin or the synthetic progesterone that's in the pill, and those have really been formulated to try to produce as few symptoms as possible, and also deliver the lowest dose possible to still be effective as a contraceptive, but not have a whole lot of side effects and symptoms that come along with them. So all that to say, I think that for most people who are taking a modern day contraceptive, they probably will not experience noticeable performance differences. But if you subjectively are experiencing some of the side effects and symptoms that go along with some of these pills, and those can be things like like mood swings, as well as lethargy, and and if those are kind of interfering with day to day, that and therefore that translates over into how you're feeling in the gym, maybe that's not the right pill for you. And there are so many formulations out there, so you could certainly consider switching. But do I think every athlete or every woman who is exercising should be really concerned about the influence of the contraceptives? No, I don't see that for the majority of women. And many athletes actually prefer to use a contraceptive because you can kind of keep everything really consistent. And for some people, it also alleviates the menstrual symptoms that you would experience if you weren't on the pill. So perhaps somebody who did have really bad abdominal cramps during their early follicular phase switches to a hormonal contraceptive and now doesn't experience those symptoms. And so, in that case, you could say, okay, maybe it's beneficial for training for that individual because their menstrual symptoms were so debilitating. But that doesn't mean there's something anabolic about hormonal contraceptives.
Now, would you say there's any negative repercussions associated with long-term use of oral contraceptives?
We really don't have that data, and there are other areas of research that would certainly benefit from that data as well, because contraceptives are so widely used. And so kind of from an overall health perspective or a fertility perspective, and not just an exercise performance perspective, but they haven't been around long enough for us to do any kind of really long-term trials to say, oh, if you're taking these when you're in your 20s or 30s, how is this affecting you when you're in your 60s or 70s? That kind of research takes a long time. So I'd say that obviously you make those decisions with your physician, and there's nothing to indicate that on average they aren't perfectly safe. As I said, it's a very low dose hormone, but in terms of how long you should be on them and if there are any kind of effects down the road, that's the jury is still out on that. So I don't think anyone could confidently say yes or no one way or the other.
Great recap. And just to bring it back all together, the best approach is going to be one that's individualized, because it's no one size fits all, and different hormones will impact you differently at different times of the month. And same goes with your oral contraceptive. So you should definitely dive into the androgenicity or type of birth control you anticipate to use with your physician. And always, that subjective feedback can be particularly valuable at times. So always, try to tap into your biofeedback signals, things such as how am I sleeping? How am I recovering from my training? How's training performance? And you'll get a better idea of how you can structure things to optimize long-term training adaptations. So as far as some takeaways for women with regards to structuring their training, do you think that there needs to be a substantial difference with regards to things such as exercise selection or particular rep ranges they should be training in?
I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that there is a one size fits all training program for anybody. What we see is in the literature, and I'm sure you see this with your clients as well, there's a big range of individual responses, and some people, and in some cases that's response period. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that women should be training differently just because they're women. I think when we look at the research, and I'm sure you experience this as a coach, you'll see that some individuals respond better to certain programs, certain exercises, certain rep ranges, volumes, intensities, what have you, right? And when we see the kind of response to training in the literature, we see that some people are just naturally higher responders. They grow muscle, they get stronger, much more so than the average person in response to a particular intervention. But does that mean that they're a higher responder under all circumstances to all programming? Not necessarily. I think that we see in the literature, there are some people who respond better to a higher rep range program, and some people that respond better to lower reps and higher intensities. And of course, it depends on what your goals are. Where if hypertrophy is predominantly the goal, if strength is predominantly the goal, but that's not a sex specific thing. That's true for people who are exercising across the board. And I think that, again, as I'm sure you know from working with clients, you see programs that evolve over time, and you see strategies that work for a shorter term, but maybe aren't sustainable for the long term. And of course, we need to take into account what the athlete enjoys and what they have time for and what's realistic for them. And so I view this piece of it, the menstrual cycle phase, menstrual symptoms, whether you're on or off oral contraceptives, as just one component of a much bigger picture. If you're really trying to get everything dialed in terms of your training and your nutrition and your sleep and your stress levels, then having a program that allows for some kind of autoregulation when you are really tired that day, or you're not feeling very well, or you have menstrual symptoms, is totally appropriate. And so I don't think we need to be treating all women differently just because of that one factor that makes them different from men. I think that from a practical perspective, we treat them as a whole client, as a whole person, and then we put on our coaching hat. We start with evidence-based principles, and then we go from there, and we adjust the training in response to the data that we get, including the feedback from our client, to make sure that they're progressing in a way that is conducive to their goals.
Love that. And something that I appreciate, just based off of our small conversation, what little I know about you, is the fact that you tend not to generalize so much, and you hammer home the fact that things need to be individualized. And I think that's something that is unfortunately lost at times, and the field is incredibly blessed to have you conducting some literature and helping us find some answers to some of these questions. And I know we're a little bit short on time, but to recap, team, the individual variance component to things is incredibly important, and it's something that needs to be taken into account, not only from a nutrition perspective, but from a training perspective, all the way down to your exercise selection. You could even say individualizing your volume requirements is something that's equally as important as all those other variables. And oftentimes we tend to place more weight in one variable than the other, when they all have an ability to influence the totality of training adaptations, meaning your ability to get super jacked or super strong. And I want to thank you for coming on the episode, Lauren. Do you have anything that you'd like to leave the audience with, or anything to plug as far as upcoming projects goes?
Sure. I think one of the main things to keep in mind when you're looking at the literature is the way we design studies and the way we report results are looking at group level averages. And so a scientific paper is never going to tell you how to train. And so it's not designed that way. And that's why we need the literature and we need coaches, because we can take this is probably what's going to work on average for most people, or this is probably important, on average for most people. But the whole concept of the average that then it's a great start, but don't put too much stock in one finding based on the group means. In terms of what I have coming up, as you said, I did just publish that review paper, but I'm also finishing up 2 studies, one looking at the influence of performance and muscle protein synthesis in each menstrual cycle phase. And I did the same study in the active and inactive pill phases in oral contraceptive users. So I will be finishing up the analysis for that over the next couple months, but very excited to publish that work, and I'll be happy to share it, and enthusiastic about the findings, whatever they may be. And you can follow me on Instagram. It's Lauren CS1, and I post my mass, or that you can subscribe to mass if you're interested in reading those articles too. And I also post my literature, my publications on there if you're interested in following along.
Incredible. Go check out her paper, get those numbers for accessed spiked. And thank you so much for your time, Lauren. We look forward to following along more of your research.
Thank you for having me.
Talk soon. Bye.